Morning, guys. What we're going to do here is an example of when you would want to do a union operation, and that what that'll do is pull two different metachains together, and you'll see that you can combine things from two separate columns that you would typically have in a generic table into one column. And an example of where you might want to use this is where we will have a metachain that's going to go from a block that'll be a different metachain than what you would use to show some other bits of information. So, for instance, if we have a block and it has a value property, and that value property has a satisfy relationship going to a requirement, that'll be a different relationship or a different metachain to go from the requirement to that block, as in if you just had a satisfy relationship going from the block to that requirement. And it's because you're going from the requirement to the value property and then the value properties block versus going from a requirement to simply just going to the block. So let's look at the actual meta chain that will get us from the requirement to the block here versus the requirement to this block. So if we go into the specification for this requirement, we're going to follow that satisfy relationship. So we see that there's a supplier dependency to the satisfy, and then we go to the specification for the satisfy, and we see that there's a value property, but notice we don't see the block anywhere yet, right? So if we go to the client and then go to its value property, and now we're seeing the value property has an owner, and that owner is the block. So that'll be our first meta chain. Whereas when we go through this direction, we go to the specification for this requirement, we see there is a satisfy relationship. It's still the supplier dependency. Open the specification, and then right there is the block. We didn't have to go another hop. It was directly connected, and it's called the source. So we're going to do those two metachains now in a generic table. So if you open up a generic table, we'll use the requirements as the element type and scope it to the entire model. For this example, now what we'll do is we'll create a new derived property. The difference between the new derived property and the custom column is that if you do a new derived property, you can actually see that in other tables. So you're creating a form of traceability, and you will actually see that show up in specification windows for all your requirements. So for instance, remember how we did not see that block in the max mass requirement? Well, if we create a meta chain that tells us how to get from that requirement to that block, and we name it something, now it'll show up in the specification window for that requirement if we create it as a new derived property. Whereas if we create this column as a new custom column, it will simply show up in this table. It will not show up anywhere else in the model. So a derived property is a great thing to do because you can see it in other tables, or you could see it in other specification windows throughout your model. The one problem you can run into with that, however, is if you do not name this exactly what it should be called, then it could confuse you later if it pulls in other information that you didn't realize it would pull in as well. So for this case, we'll use a new derived property, but you have to be careful with those and just make sure you name them appropriately, or you may run into some confusion later down the road. So we'll use a meta chain. We'll go from the requirement to the supplier dependency, and then we'll do a dependency. We'll do a supplier dependency, and then we'll do the satisfy relationship. And we'll use the client. All right. I'm sorry, not the client. We'll use the source. On this one, we'll use the source. And now one other thing to keep in mind is you should probably go to expert mode and tell it which type you want. And for this one, we'll use a class. because a block is a type of a class. Now notice here, we got two things here. We got the value property in this one, and we got the block in this one. And I think what we were looking for was simply that block, right? So let's go back and edit that and go one step further and say we want the value property and then the value property's owner, which was that block. And now what we're seeing is the block that was related to that requirement. And notice, remember, these were connected by that value property, but we're going to that value property's owner because we just want to see the block that it's connected to. So notice we didn't get this one, however, and that's because it was that other meta chain. So let's create a new derived property. And we'll do a meta chain starting with the requirement, and it was the same thing, supplier dependency. And then the next level down was a dependency and then source. And for this one, we'll use the class as the type. And we got similar results there as we got last time. So for this one, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to narrow these, filter this down to where I only see the block because I don't want to see the value property. So we'll do a block and say OK. And that filters out that value property. So now what you're looking at is you have requirements and they're two different blocks that they're connected to. But we most likely would want to see both of these in the same column because it could start using up a lot of room here if you have a whole bunch of other columns that you're trying to show information in. And we most likely would want to have these converged. So what we can do is a union operation, and we'll do a new derived property for that. And we're simply going to do both of these meta chains again, but we'll combine them using a union. So if you go down here to create operation, you have this operation or this option for union. However, I'm going to remove that because notice it shows up saying create operation like this, but it doesn't actually give you the options for your collections. So if you click create operation and then search your model, so operation from the model, and then do a union, and uncheck the apply filter, you have this union operation here. And now it gives you these two collections, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to do two different meta chains. We're going to drag one meta chain into the collection one meta chain into the collection 2, and then it'll simply combine both of those into the same column. So we'll start out with using this meta chain here, and we'll do the exact meta chains we just did. We'll do them over again. So we did supplier dependency, and then we did a satisfy, and then client, and then we did the value property and the value property's owner. And then we changed the type to element. And what I'll do is just name this metachain navigation 1. All right. And now we'll go down here and create another operation. We'll do another metachain. So this will be our metachain 2. And we'll do the same as we did last with the second column. So we did supplier dependency, and then dependency and source. And then we change the element type. or to class, and we filtered by block. All right, so that's our second metachain. So we have metachain 1 here, metachain 2 here, and we simply drag these in to the collections. So it becomes the scope of that collection. And then we drag in metachain navigation here 2 to collection 2. And then let's give this a name. So we'll call this requirements block. Or let's call it satisfying block. Now when we say OK, we end up with both of these in the same column. And then what I would do is go back and just remove these. And then you've cleaned that up nicely. You see that you have this requirement was connected to this block, even though it was actually directly connected to that value property. And then you have this requirement that was directly connected to that block, and you're seeing both of those in those same column. And now if we look in the specification for one of these, you can see that there's now that field that was named, that it should be named requirements satisfying block, whereas that field did not exist before. So right here, it exists in the specification window for all the requirements now, because we created that as a new derived property. So we have requirements satisfying block, and if you remember, that area was not in the specification window before, and it is now. So we have requirement satisfying block for subsystem 1. And then if we look in the other one here, we should have that same thing. So requirement satisfying block is subsystem 2. And there you go. So that's an example of how you can use the union operation to combine things into one column.